Flight 402 was fully booked, carrying 524 passengers from Chicago to Los Angeles. The hum of conversation, the soft rustling of magazines, and the occasional squeak of a rolling suitcase created a gentle buzz throughout the cabin. Among the passengers, Eleanor Hayes sat quietly in seat 14C, her attention buried in a medical journal. She was a woman in her early 30s with chestnut hair pulled into a neat bun, and an air of calm about her that often went unnoticed. Most people didn't see her, and she preferred it that way. Today was supposed to be like any other flight routine, uneventful. Another journey she would endure with minimal notice or attention. As the Airbus A380 taxied down the runway, Eleanor glanced briefly out the window at the gray Chicago sky. Rain had begun to drizzle, painting the tarmac in muted reflections. She tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear and adjusted the strap of her bag. The engines roared to life, and she felt the familiar vibration through her seat as the plane accelerated. The aircraft lifted off with a smooth ascent, gliding above the clouds. From her vantage point, Eleanor watched the city shrink below her, the skyscrapers dissolving into a patchwork of lights and wet streets. She returned to her reading, unaware of the subtle tension that had begun to build in the cabin. For the first 2 hours, everything was routine. The cabin lights dimmed, flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, serving snacks and beverages, and passengers dozed off or chatted quietly. Eleanor occasionally glanced around, observing the people near her, a young couple whispering to each other, a man in business attire tapping at a laptop, a family of 3 with a small child nervously clutching a stuffed toy. All seemed ordinary, yet behind the cockpit door, a storm was quietly brewing. Suddenly, the calm was shattered. The cabin lights flickered once, then twice, as if the plane itself were shivering. A low hum resonated through the fuselage, unusual and alarming. Eleanor looked up from her journal, her eyes scanning the aisle. Flight attendants were speaking urgently into their radios, faces pale, moving with a hurried intensity that immediately drew attention. Passengers whispered, some laughing nervously, others frowning in confusion. A few pointed toward the cockpit door, now slightly ajar. Is something wrong? A woman near Eleanor asked in a trembling voice. Eleanor's stomach tightened. She followed the gaze of the passengers and froze. The 2 pilots were slumped in their seats, completely motionless, their heads tilted unnaturally to one side. The realization struck Eleanor like lightning. Both pilots had collapsed. The enormity of the situation hit her all at once. 524 lives, hundreds of miles above the ground, and no one at the control. Panic began to ripple through the cabin. A man in the row ahead shouted, "Call someone. Someone has to do something." Flight attendants moved quickly to contain the chaos, urging passengers to remain calm, but their own expressions betrayed fear. Eleanor's pulse quickened, yet a strange, focused calm began to take over her mind. She had read about emergency procedures, about aviation, about what to do in a crisis. She wasn't a trained pilot, but instinct and knowledge surged through her in a way that demanded action. A flight attendant approached her, hesitation and desperation in her eyes. "Please, you have to help. Someone has to take control," she implored. Eleanor felt a wave of fear wash over her, but she nodded, swallowing hard. She followed the attendants to the cockpit, each step heavier than the last, knowing that her next actions could determine life or death for everyone on board. The cockpit was a labyrinth of buttons, levers, screens, and gauges. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had only read about these instruments, never touched them, never imagined she would be responsible for them. Her hands hovered over the yoke, trembling slightly while she processed the sheer scale of the responsibility. The autopilot, the throttle, the radar, the altitude indicators, all of it suddenly became her world. The flight attendants hovered nearby, offering encouragement and trying to mask their own fear. Meanwhile, the passengers in the cabin were growing restless. Murmurs turned to shouts, feared outright panic. A mother clutched her young child, whispering reassurances that barely masked her own terror. Elderly passengers clutched armrests, eyes wide with anxiety. Yet, amid the chaos, Eleanor found a thread of composure. She turned to the intercom, her voice steady, though her hands shook slightly. "Everyone, please remain seated and stay calm. Help is on the way. Follow instructions. Everything will be okay." Her words, though simple, had a ripple effect. The murmurs slowed, the panic softened, and the cabin began to listen. Eleanor had never felt such a burden, nor such clarity. She realized that hesitation would cost lives. She studied the controls, her mind recalling every snippet of information she had absorbed from books, articles, and previous flights. The autopilot could hold the plane steady. She could manage communications. She could prevent disaster long enough for help to arrive. As the plane continued to climb steadily above the clouds, Eleanor positioned herself firmly in the captain's seat, gripping the yoke with newfound determination. Outside the cockpit windows, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and threatening. She could feel the plane shudder slightly as turbulence began to buff at the fuselage. The hum of the engines was a constant reminder that there was no turning back. Eleanor Hayes, the quiet woman in 14C, was now the person responsible for 524 lives, and she would not falter. The moment Eleanor stepped fully into the cockpit, the weight of responsibility hit her like a physical force. The two pilots remained slumped and unresponsive, their faces pale under the harsh glow of the instrument panels. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and looked at the flight attendants who had followed her in. They stood tensely, eyes darting between her and the controls, clearly hoping she might somehow be the miracle they needed. Eleanor had no choice. Hesitation could cost hundreds of lives. She straightened her shoulders and sat down in the captain's chair, gripping the yoke with trembling hands. Her first instinct was to stabilize the aircraft. The autopilot, she remembered from reading, was the key. She reached for the controls, studying the layout as if the panels would suddenly reveal their secrets. The buttons, levers, and screens were overwhelming at first glance, but she focused on the essentials: maintaining altitude, keeping the plane level, and communicating with air traffic control. With careful movements, she activated the autopilot, and the Airbus steadied, gliding smoothly through the clouds. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold long enough for her to plan the next steps. Outside, the weather was worsening. Dark clouds rolled across the sky, and distant lightning illuminated the horizon. Eleanor's heart pounded as she glanced at the radar. Storm cells were moving rapidly toward the flight path. She had to act carefully. Any sudden maneuver could trigger panic in the cabin, or worse, destabilize the plane. Her mind raced, cataloging everything she knew about flying. Gradual adjustments, small course corrections, smooth inputs on the controls. Focus, she told herself. Focus. The flight attendants looked at her expectantly, their hope pinned on someone who had never flown a plane in an emergency. One of them handed her a headset, pointing to the radio. Eleanor picked it up and pressed the button to speak. "This is Flight 402, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Both pilots are unconscious. I am taking control, requesting immediate guidance." Static answered at first, then a crackling voice emerged. "Flight 42, can you read us? We're here. Confirm your situation." "Yes, I read you," Eleanor replied quickly, trying to maintain composure. "Both pilots are down. I am in the cockpit and stabilizing the plane." "Understood. Stay calm," the controller instructed. "We will guide you. Engage autopilot and maintain current altitude." "Can you do that?" "Yes," Eleanor said, pressing the buttons to confirm autopilot engagement. Her hands shook slightly, but she forced herself to breathe evenly. She knew panic was contagious, and if the controller sensed doubt, it could worsen the situation. The cabin remained tense. Eleanor had returned briefly to the intercom, her voice cutting through the murmur of anxious passengers. "Everyone, please remain in your seats. Fasten your seatbelts. We are experiencing a medical emergency in the cockpit. Crew members are assisting, and we are in contact with ground control. Everything is under control." Some passengers visibly relaxed, while others continued to fidget and whisper. Eleanor's gaze swept across the cabin. She saw the mother holding her child, a young man gripping the armrests, and an elderly couple staring wide-eyed at the ceiling. Their fear was palpable, but so was their trust in the voice they had come to rely on. Eleanor realized that at this moment, she was not just the pilot of the plane, but the anchor for everyone on board. Time seemed to stretch. The autopilot kept the plane level, but turbulence began to increase. The aircraft shuddered as pockets of unstable air buffeted the wings. Eleanor's knuckles widened around the yoke. She adjusted the throttle slightly to maintain speed and ease the strain of the turbulence. Every flick of the instruments required careful attention, every movement deliberate. She could not afford a single mistake. She tried the radio again, this time more persistently. "Flight 402. You copy, requesting step-by-step instructions for descent if needed." The controller responded immediately. Voice urgent but calm. "Affirmative. We will walk you through everything. Do not attempt maneuvers unless instructed. Autopilot should hold until we guide you closer to the airport." Eleanor nodded to herself, even though they could not see her. She kept her hands lightly on the yoke, ready to override autopilot if necessary. She checked fuel levels, altitude, speed, and the navigation display. The plane was steady but heavy, like a giant waiting for a command. She realized how vulnerable everyone was at that altitude, how easily a wrong move could turn stability into disaster. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Eleanor's focus sharpened. She repeated mental checklists she had memorized, scanning for anything that could go wrong: cabin pressure, engine performance, control surfaces. She alternated between listening to the controller and monitoring the instruments. Each successful adjustment built a small, fragile, confident. Suddenly, lightning flashed across the cockpit windows. Eleanor flinched, then remembered her training. Visual shocks were normal in storms, and panic would only make things worse. She guided the plane gently around the most dangerous storm cells, making slow, deliberate correction. Each adjustment required careful calculation. Outside, the sky was a turbulent sea of gray and black. but inside the cockpit, Eleanor's comm was a beacon. By now, the flight attendants had returned to their stations in the cabin, reassuring passengers and keeping order. Eleanor glanced back at them, offering a small nod. She felt a strange sense of connection, the shared responsibility for the lives in the cabin. Despite her fear, she felt a determination she had never known. She was no longer just a passenger. She was the pilot, the voice of reason, the one keeping chaos at bay. As Flight 402 continued on autopilot, Eleanor allowed herself a moment to breathe. However shallow, she knew the hardest part was yet to come, descending through the storm and preparing for landing. But for now, she had stabilized the situation. She had prevented panic from spiraling and had maintained control of the aircraft. She was against all odds keeping the plane in the air, and that was enough for the moment. Sat in the captain's chair, her knuckles pale against the yoke as the autopilot held Flight 402 steady. The storm ahead was growing, massive clouds rolling and twisting with an almost malevolent energy. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the wings and fuselage. In brief, blinding flashes, turbulence rattled the plane, making her stomach turn. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of the mental checklist she had drilled in her mind. Maintain altitude, monitor instruments, communicate with air traffic control, and keep calm. One misstep and hundreds of lives could be lost. She picked up the headset again, pressing the button to speak. Flight 402 to ground control. We need immediate guidance for descent. Both pilots are unconscious. I need step-by-step instructions. A crackling voice returned. Flight 402, we read you. Keep autopilot engaged for now. Maintain current altitude. A commercial pilot from a nearby flight will guide you step by step. Stay calm, you can do this. You have to understand, Eleanor said, her voice steady but urgent. I've never flown a plane in this kind of emergency. I've read about it. Yes, but this is real. I need guidance. Understood. The controller replied calmly. Step 1. Ensure your autopilot maintains level flight. Step 2. Stabilize heading to avoid the worst of the storm cells. We'll guide you through descent when conditions allow. Eleanor nodded, though no one could see her. She glanced at the radar, noting clusters of dense storm activity ahead. The autopilot was holding, but the plane shuddered with every gust. She adjusted the throttle slightly to compensate, careful not to over. Outside, the gray clouds pressed in, thick and menacing. Her hands shook only slightly now. Fear had transformed into a focused determination she had never experienced. She looked around the cockpit. The two pilots remained slumped and pale. Their unconscious forms a stark reminder of the stakes. Eleanor repressed her lips together and returned to the instruments. Fuel levels were stable, engines operating normally, but the altitude needed constant monitoring. She had read that turbulence could cause minor shifts in flight path, and even small deviations could escalate in such a storm. Every lever, every dial, every blink and screen mattered. Minutes passed, each one stretching impossibly long. Eleanor toggled the radio again, keeping in contact with the controller. The nearby commercial pilot's voice crackled through intermittently, offering reassurance and guidance. Stay calm, Eleanor. Autopilot is holding. Focus on altitude. Keep wings level, and follow my instructions when we prepare for descent. She repeated mental calculations of speed, altitude, and angle. The plane was heavy, a flying city suspended in midair, and every adjustment had to be precise. Eleanor found herself speaking aloud to steady her nerves. Smooth, steady, careful. Control your inputs. You've got this. Her voice was quiet, but it helped her maintain composure. Back in the cabin, passengers were tense, but responding to her earlier announcements. The flight attendants moved efficiently, checking seatbelts and calming nervous travelers. A mother whispered quietly to her child, "The lady is taking care of us. Everything will be okay." Eleanor heard the faint intercom responses and felt a small wave of reassurance. She was not alone in keeping this flight alive. Then the plane hit a particularly violent pocket of turbulence. The Airbus shuddered violently, a low groan of metal reverberating through the cabin. Eleanor gritted her teeth, gripping the yoke just long enough to override minor fluctuations, then allowed the autopilot to resume control. Sweat ran down her face, but she refused to move, refusing to let fear dominate. The storm raged around them, but inside the cockpit, she was a center of calm, a single point of determination amidst chaos. As the plane continued, the controller spoke again. Flight 402, prepare for descent. Visibility is limited. Follow our instructions precisely. You will need to manage throttle and flaps manually, but we will guide you step by step. Are you ready? Eleanor nodded, though the headset did not require it. Yes, I'm ready. She reviewed the panels, her eyes scanning every gauge, every warning light. The autopilot could only take her so far. The descent would require real manual control, and the storm made it all the more dangerous. She reminded herself of one fundamental truth: smooth, gradual inputs, no sudden movements, no panicked reactions. She had to stay methodical. The commercial pilot's voice guided her through the steps. Reduce altitude gradually. Monitor airspeed. Flaps 1. Do not overcorrect. Keep wings level. Eleanor adjusted the throttle, watching the altimeter drop slowly. The plane trembled in response to wind gusts, but she maintained control, making tiny adjustments as instructed. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears, but her movements were precise, deliberate. Outside, lightning continued to flash, illuminating the massive rolling clouds like a strobe. Eleanor held her focus, resisting the urge to glance away. She repeated her mantra silently. Control, focus, breathe. She felt the aircraft respond to her adjustments, each small success giving her a fraction of confidence, one correct maneuver after another. She guided the massive plane down safely through the storm layer, each second an accomplishment of immense consequence. By now, the cabin was tense, but calmer. Passengers had started to trust the voice they heard over the intercom. Eleanor's.com instructions reinforced by the crew created an anchor amidst the storm. She realized the flight was no longer just about keeping the plane in the air. It was about maintaining hope. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed. The descent continued carefully, Eleanor following every instruction. She had never imagined that she, a quiet woman in 14C, would become the fulcrum upon which hundreds of lives rested. But as the storm began to thin on the radar, and the horizon showed a faint glimpse of lighter sky, Eleanor allowed herself a moment to breathe. She had stabilized the aircraft and prepared it for the next most critical phase land. The runway lights of Midway Airport appeared faintly through the dissipating storm, a ribbon of hope. Stretching across the darkened landscape, Eleanor's hands gripped the yoke firmly, knuckles white but steady. The autopilot had brought them this far, keeping flight 402 level and on course. But the final moments would require her full attention. The commercial pilot guiding her over the radio was calm, but Eleanor knew that every command had to be executed perfectly. One mistake now could undo everything. Eleanor, the voice crackled through the headset. Prepared to disengage, autopilot. You'll need to control throttle flaps and the descent manually. Keep wings level. Focus on smooth inputs. You've got this. Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the tension coiling in her chest. She slowly disengaged the autopilot, feeling the aircraft respond directly to her hands. The Airbus trembled slightly in the gusting wind, but she adjusted gently, making incremental corrections. Every movement was deliberate, measured as she focused entirely on the instruments, the horizon, and the radio guidance. The turbulence had not fully passed, and occasional pockets of rough air shook the plane. Eleanor's heart raced, but she repeated her mantra silently, steady, smooth, calm. She guided the flaps down gradually, monitoring the airspeed, keeping the wings level, and listening intent.